Okay, so we're going to talk some about the local church. As always, if you have questions or comments, I certainly excited to hear those, and would certainly encourage you to participate in the class. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen now that will have a couple scriptures on it that we're going to study together. I think this is the one that I want here. Yeah. Okay, everybody see that slide? Can you see a slide? No. Did I share the wrong one, maybe? Hang on. Let me see. Uh, can you see it now?
Yeah, put something on it. There it is. Yep,
There
got
it
it.
is. Got
Yep.
it. Okay, good, good. Okay, so what we talked about last week, let's just review a little bit. And if you have questions about this, we'll discuss it some more about the use of the terminology in the New Testament. Anybody remember the Greek word that's translated by the English word church?
Ecclesia.
Ecclesia. So the ecclesia is the word that appears in the New Testament. The significance is not just to know the Greek word, but to understand that the meaning of the original word was a word that simply meant assembly. And two thoughts about that we talked about is that it's an assembly of groups that have been called out. So the connotation of the word, if you break it up into two parts, it's the idea of being called out of or called out of a particular circumstance of relationship into another. Even used physically to talk about being called out of one place into another. So the New Testament uses a word that describes God's people as those who have called out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his love, Colossians, and the other passages that would show us that particular connotation. But it is a collective noun in its use, which means that it refers to a group. So it's a corporate term like flock or herd or something like along those lines. Um, the church then is a collective noun that it doesn't refer to a building. It's not an institution separate from the people, so that you have the church and then you have the people in the church. You have the church are the people in the sense that they are the saved. The church is not a collection of denominations or congregations. And that's an important thing in terms of what we're going to discuss tonight, because we're going to talk about congregations and about local churches. And one thing that we'll submit to us to our study right now is that the universal church, the church of that everybody, all the saved comprise, is made up of individuals, not of congregations or denominations. So there is no Church of Christ denomination. There is no Church of Christ congregations. It's the church that belongs to Christ, or Church of Christ that is made up of individual Christians. And so that is what we talk about when we talk about being undenominational in terms of how the Bible describes it. Sometimes people use the word undenominational today in religion to just mean unaffiliated, and it certainly has that characteristic to it, that something that's undenominational, not made up of different parts, does have less affiliation. But the idea of undenominationalism is not so much unaffiliated as it has to do with what comprises the whole. And what comprises the whole are individuals and not individual individual congregations. And we'll see as we go along, maybe we'll see why that's an important thing for us to remember. But if we realize that the word ecclesia means assembly, we also have to recognize that the scriptures, New Testament, doesn't always use the word church in the same way. It's not always referring to the same group or the same assembly in every context, in every passage. There are at least three, as I see, there are at least three views of groups as the way the word church is used in the New Testament. We've already talked about this some. One is that it's all the saved of every place and time. So, what is the church? It's everybody that's been saved. Old Testament, New Testament, dead, alive, everybody that has been saved is in the church. I would arrive at that conclusion because in Acts chapter 2, where the individuals in the day of Pentecost are being saved, it says that the Lord added them together as they were being saved. it implies the aspect that there is already a group of saved people, and those who were being obedient to the gospel on that day were being added to them. Um, and so that's I think other places like Hebrews where it talks about that the New Jerusalem, the idea that it's the spirits of men made just, that's the universal, everybody included church. But there are a couple of passages where we'd see that that's what's in view. Matthew 16:18, Jesus says, I will build my church. Well, he's not talking about a congregation. He's not talking about even a group of congregations. He's talking about everyone that would be saved would be a part of his church. Acts chapter 20, verse 28, the Apostle Paul says that Jesus purchased the church with his own blood. Well, how many Christians were purchased? Well, all of them were. That's a universal element of that, even though the context of that passage is about a local eldership, shepherd the flock of God which is among you. Paul uses the term church there in a universal context when he talks about Jesus purchased the church. Passages like Ephesians chapter 1 that we looked at last week, Jesus is the head of the church. It says that twice in chapter 1, verse 22, chapter 5, verse 23. So the head, the body there, that's the church, is a universal body. And Jesus is the head over not just part of it, but over all of it. And 1 Corinthians 12:13, that the idea that you were, through one spirit, you were baptized into one body. And Ephesians chapter 4 as well, there is one body. We understand the body there being the church. There's one church, and that's the universal church. The other way that contrasts that is that sometimes when the scriptures use the word ecclesia, they use it to refer to a local congregation or a group of people that have an association affiliation. In fact, they're even referred to as a body of Christ, but they're not all the Christians. They're just a part of the Christians. And so there's a group of saved in a locality who decide, as we're going to see, who decide to jointly participate or fellowship in God's work. So in the scriptures, as I see it, a local church were a group of Christians who decided that they were going to fellowship each other in the things they would do together, the corporate things they would do together. They would worship together. They would do work together. And that the New Testament, the text of the New Testament identifies them as a church. So there was a church in Rome. There was a church in Jerusalem. There's a church in Thessalonica. And that's what some of these passages I have on the board refer to, that the idea that they were individual churches that are in view. And the some of those passages I think we're probably familiar with in the aspect uh, of like the churches of Revelation chapter 2 and 3, church at Pergamos, church at Sardis. How do we interpret that? What does that mean? Well, it means that there were local congregations of people that the Bible referred to as churches in this. And I don't think we're not going to take time to go over all those passages, but I have some of those that are mentioned there in that way in the scriptures that are listed on the board. Uh, sometimes it's used in a plural sense, such as Romans 16:16, the churches of Christ salute you, or it talks about the churches of Galatia. So they were on the churches of Asia. There was more than one congregation in the region of Asia. And there were cities that had congregations. It may very well have been that there were more than one congregation in a particular city. Really don't know that because that necessarily doesn't imply that, because the Bible talks about the church at Rome as though there was one church at Rome. The church at Thessalonica as though there was one church at Thessalonica. So it'd be speculation for me to assume that there were more than one assembly when the Bible talks about, use the word church there, singularly talk about a congregation. Okay, and then the last one is that sometimes, or at least in the case of 1 Corinthians, that the scriptures use the word church to talk about the church as it is assembled, or what we might think of as the context of the assembly itself. So Paul says there, I permit not a woman to speak in the church. He doesn't mean that once she becomes a Christian, you can never say anything. But there was the assembly of the church that he was talking about. It refers to that as the ecclesia in that text, as the assembly of the church. And that's particularly in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 about the use of spiritual gifts. So we are the church when we are assembled. Are we the church when we're not assembled? Are we still the church even though we're not assembled? Yeah, yes, we are.
I
So,
think it would be.
so the idea that we are still in the body, we're still part of the body, even though we're not assembled. But Paul used the word ecclesia to talk about the church in the assembly itself. And we'll talk about the assembly here in just a few moments. So that's an interesting distinction there. Yeah,
Hey, Dave,
yeah, Todd, go ahead.
I think it's interesting, or not interesting. I just the sometimes in a modern society, if somebody said these people are going after the church, or they're trying to wreak havoc against the church, they're oftentimes referring to where the headquarters is, right? Like,
Yeah,
whereas when there was a great persecution against the church, in Acts 1 there, later on it says that Saul wreaked havoc against the church, going into houses and dragging men and women out. He didn't go try to find
yeah.
the the leadership structure and kill them. Killing or destroying the church meant going after its members.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of those passages in Acts 9 where the idea of wreaking havoc on the church and then mentioning men and women, just like you say, it's pretty clear evidence that the church there are people, not anything other than the people. So how do you wreak havoc on the church? We don't tear down the building, you persecute the people, and that's what that pass. Very good thought on that. That I think makes that point for us. Uh, Okay, now another question I wanted to ask and maybe answer in the context of the class is, does the Bible teach the necessity and viability of local churches? There are some in religion today who say, well, I want to be a Christian. I'm going to live as a Christian, but I don't have any use for a local church. I'm just going to be a Christian at home. I'm going to serve God at home, and that I'm just going to sort of serve God on my own. I don't have to associate with another church. And I think that the idea of what the Bible teaches is not. It comes from understanding what, as best we can, what took place in the first century, how people operated, so to speak, after they became Christians. Did they join themselves together? Was there a desire for them to join themselves together, and was there a purpose in being together, or did God call them just to become Christians and go home and serve God by themselves? I think if we did nothing other than just took the New Testament and went through and marked all the one another passages, all the passages where Christians are given responsibility to do something in behalf of someone else, love one another, greet one another, pray for one another, build one another up, that there are so many passages that are directed towards my responsibility towards another Christian, toward another person, and then also a highlight with that the times in which the scriptures talks about Christians being in an assembly or together physically, that it would seem clear that the first century church uh, did associate together, and that Christians were not Christians at large. That Christians were Christians within a local body. So that's an important point. I might mention this. I meant to mention this earlier. You think about Acts 2, we get a lot of information about the church from Acts 2. We studied that last week, where the church began, the coming of the Holy Spirit, the preaching of the gospel. People repented and were baptized, and the Lord added them together to the church. And then it also tells us in the remarks that Luke makes after that what the church did together. They shared all things in common. They gave to one another. And then later on, they were praying together. Um, is that the local church or is that the universal church? Because a lot of times when we look at Acts 2, we talk about Jesus establishing his church universally. We will read passages from Acts 2 and say, well, this is what it is. This is when it happened. And we'd be right about that. That is there in an inaugural view, that is the universal church because that's the only church that existed at that time. But also we recognize that the church at Jerusalem was a local congregation. In fact, later on talks about the elders of the church at Jerusalem. James was one of those. Talks about the church at Jerusalem sending preachers out, such as Barnabas, to go to Antioch. Well, that wasn't the universal church working, nor was it the church at Jerusalem acting as a mother church of other churches. It was simply that congregation was a local congregation of God's people, and they were doing what local congregations of God people did. So we in Acts 2, there's sort of a unique view. There's both the universal church and the local church in view. Now, what we find later on in the rest of the book of Acts is that you have clearly you have individual churches, local churches that that are created through the preaching of the gospel in different localities. So there came to be a church at Antioch, and there came to be a church at Ephesus, and Berea. And so the idea that churches grew up, or they were created, so to speak, by the preaching of the gospel. Those churches were uniquely only local churches. They weren't all the Christians. They were Christians outside those congregations. I think that's pretty obvious to us. But those two groups are distinct, except in the book of Acts and 2, when we have that sort of complementary view of the universal local church to be able to decipher. But are Christians expected to form congregations? Are they supposed to come together? A couple of passages that would make me answer that question absolutely yes. Is that the idea of churches, individual groups, was almost assumed in the New Testament. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8, Paul said, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. Now, the term churches there is ecclesia in the plural form. What does it imply? Well, it implies that there were more than one local congregation. Now, it's only one church. Jesus only has one church, but there were different churches in the sense that there were different local congregations, and that these congregations worked together, or they worked towards the common goal of supporting the gospel. So they were more churches that supported Paul than just one, sent him support. And so it would indicate to us in that regard that they worked corporately. In other words, Christians worked corporately. If a church sent support, where'd they get that support? From the individuals that make up the church, right? So does this imply a treasury? Does it imply that they put their money together? If Paul wanted to say that Christians individually gave to him, then why would he use the word ecclesia to talk about the support of the church unless there was a contribution made from that church as a whole? So the church at Thessalonica sent him, church at Philippi sent him. So the idea of churches there supporting Paul implies the aspect that those Christians worked together within groups. Now, there are other places where that's pretty obvious that that's what was taking place when Paul urged Christians, the church at Corinth, to give a contribution. He was talking about the church members of that church there giving, not laying by in store so that they might give to the poor saints in Judea. So that there are other places where that becomes more apparent. But do you see the distinction I'm making there, or the point that I'm making? In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 16, this is a very enlightening verse when we talk about concepts of the church. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. The two entities of responsibility in that passage is the individual person who has a widow in their family. They are individually responsible for taking care of that widow. But if the widow does not have any family, then the church, ecclesia, the corporate body of Christians, then can take care of that widow, should take care of that widow. But if the individuals can do it, then the church is not to be burdened. Isn't that what Paul's saying? So there's a difference between individual responsibility and congregational responsibility in this passage, and that sort of presents one of the distinction there. So saints, Christians act collectively, and they act individually in that regard. And we're going to talk about some in a later lesson. We'll talk about some of the parameters of that. What's my responsibility individually? It's not the same as what my responsibility is corporately, what I do collectively with other Christians. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul says, you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church, ecclesia, entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. So the idea there is that the church acted collectively in supporting Paul. Now, if we go to the very first chapter of Philippians, when Paul begins writing that church to that church there, he describes it as a group of Christians who have elders and deacons. So he gives us sort of, at the beginning of that letter, he gives us sort of a definitive look at what a church was like in terms of its leadership, or one of the characteristics of a local church is it had elders and it had deacons. And we'll talk about that in a few moments, but that's one of the characteristics. There was no time in the New Testament when an eldership ruled over more than one congregation, but every congregation was to have elders because Paul said they should appoint elders in every church. 1 Corinthians 11, Paul writing to the church at Corinth says, when you come together as a church, or when you come together in an assembly, and there again we have that idea of the church assembled and the church unassembled. But the idea here is that a church, not only that a church does assemble, but it comes together to do things collectively. What were they doing in 1 Corinthians 11 that Paul said they were doing wrong? Anybody remember?
Lord
They
Supper.
were,
The Lord's Supper. That's right, the Lord's Supper. He says in verse 17, but in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, for the worse. And that fascinating thing to say to a church, be better off to not come together than what you're doing. But he says, for in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part, for there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry and another gets drunk. So he's saying that he tells them there, when you come together, you're not really eating the Lord's Supper. That's what you're supposedly coming together to do, but you're just taking a regular old meal, treating it that way, even to the point of excluding those who are really who are poor from the particular activity. So my point being that the church assembled, and it assembled for a specific purpose. Paul assumes, 1 Corinthians 11, the church at Corinth was coming together to take the Lord's Supper. And that's the reason he used that language. That's when you come together, it's not to take the Lord's Supper. You're mistaken about that. You're not doing that. They were to assemble for that purpose. Acts 20 and 7 correlates to this, because there it says in Acts 20 and 7 that when Paul was at Troas, that they came together on the first day of the week to break bread. And that breaking of bread was the Lord's Supper. So that's where we would come to the conclusion that the Lord's church met on the first day of the week, the day of Jesus' resurrection, and that they came together to break bread to take the Lord's Supper. You put 1 Corinthians 11 together, Acts 20, verse 7, that becomes clear that that's why they were coming together for, was to take the Lord's Supper. And the necessary implication of that is that they did it every first day of the week, the same way that Paul makes that very same type of statement about the contribution. Let each one of, on every first day of the week, let each one of you lay by in store, he says, about the contribution. Okay, but maybe we'll talk about those some more when we talk about worship and about how we look at the worship of the local church. But the point there being, it's not hard to look and see that there were local churches in the first century that were made up of individual Christians who shared in fellowship in a single body, and that was the body of Christ, but they worked together in local groups, and that those groups were called churches. So, any questions? Thoughts on that?
I have one thought, Dave,
Okay.
and maybe you're going to get to it. I'm not sure. When you say that the elders rule over the church, could you explain that a little bit?
Okay. I think there are a couple of passages that help us see the work of the elder. There are two other words besides the word for elder that are used in the New Testament to describe the single office of the single person. That is the word overseer, episkopos, or the word for pastor, the shepherd. So the shepherd, the pastor, is also called an elder. It's also called an overseer. Some translations use the word bishop. So those are not different offices. Those are all the same. And you go to Acts chapter 20, we can see that clearly, because all three terms are used to describe the same group of elders that Paul met with from Ephesus. They were called shepherds. They were told to feed the flock, and they were called overseers, and they were called elders. So those aren't three offices, are all the same, but they're not really titles. They're more descriptives of the person and the work. By calling them elders, it means that they're older. In First Timothy chapter 3, Paul makes it clear there that the elder, the person who's going to be appointed as to lead the church needs to not be a novice. He needs to be someone that has experience to the point that he has been successful in being a husband and a father. And then the word overseer means someone who superintends, exercises oversight, as the verb would be. In other words, he's an individual who has some authority and making decisions in the local congregation, and he is to look over the congregation. The word pastor has to do with the specific responsibility to feed the church, as a shepherd would feed the church. So what is he to do? Well, he's not just looking over the flock or looking over the people just to see them. His responsibility is to feed them spiritually. So he is to teach. He's to be someone who teaches, and so that's what, and even reproves and rebukes. That's what Paul points out in the qualification of 1 Timothy chapter 3. So sometimes we use the word rule, we have the wrong idea that the rule of an elder is not an autocratic type of rulership. It's not that I'm in charge and you must submit to me. Now, Hebrews 13 says the church should submit to elders, but the elder is to rule by example, and he's to be an individual, you see, who paves the way, so to speak, for the church. He must do it not for money's sake, not because he's going to get something out of it. And as Peter says, to not lord it over the church. He can't beat people on the head with the Bible or impose his will on other people. He is to be a shepherd and to lead. The idea of leading is an important part of that. It means that if I'm leading someone, who's in front?
You are.
I am. So the idea that the elder has to be someone who's doing what he's trying to get other people to do. He's already living the life he's trying to get other people to live. He's not pushing people along in that regard. So I think that's an important element of that. I don't know. Do you have a thought on that, Ralph? Is that?
No, I just think that's a good clarification. And sometimes when we hear in our modern day, we hear that somebody's ruling over us.
Yeah.
It's mistaken, especially for, maybe somebody who's newer in the faith.
That's right. And the New Testament uses the word rule, but in the context of that we should show respect to those who rule over the congregation. But like I say, it's not the aspect here of a autocratic type of authoritarian view of forcing our way on somebody else.
No, it's more a picture of the servant leadership that Jesus showed when he was on the earth.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. Servant leadership. That's exactly right. So
And
who is the greatest among us? Person
and
who's
he's not making up anything. He's not deciding new things.
That's right.
He's sort of helping the congregation do what's already been settled,
Yeah.
which is different than what an autocrat or a ruler would do. But if you don't mind, I wanted to get back to this church,
Go ahead.
universal church, local. And if
Okay.
you think about, there are some folks who would say, or, I just want to be a part of the universal church and I'm just going to walk around and sort of, do my own thing or that kind of thing. And in the Old Testament, it seemed like there was just one church, right? But when there were assemblies, they all had to go. They couldn't skip the Passover. They couldn't. So even in a time when, right, like I suppose somebody would say, well, we're just a part of one church. Understand what I'm saying? Really, they still had to assemble and do things. I think the synagogues came in much later and only for the purpose of reading and maybe praying. But anyhow, I guess my point is that it doesn't make any sense to have some sort of idea that we're just going to be part of the universal church and sort of walk around and do it by ourselves. It really doesn't make any sense, and no organized body in the world does it that I know of. If you're a member of the Moose, right, you're a member of the Moose, but you attend some sort of local Moose club, so I just, that's difficult to even make sense of or make it work in some way unless you're just a loner.
Well, think about if we are the ecclesia, if we are the assembly, then should we assemble? seems like the definition implies our responsibility. We are to assemble. Well, how's that going to happen? If I'm claiming to be only a member of the universal church, how do I assemble with the universal church? It's an impossibility.
Yeah.
Even if I just include the people that are alive here, but it doesn't just include that. It includes people that have gone on. Church universal is the church universal. There is no, now in the end, when we are gathered together at with Christ, then there will be an assembly of the universal church. And that's what Revelation describes. But
Yeah.
in the human experience, that's impossible. So exactly what you're saying, in the sense that God's provided for us to assemble, and in our assembly have a taste of what it's going to be finally when we all do get together by being together corporately in congregations. Uh, so we come together and we sing when we all get to heaven, because there is one assembly that reflects another. So it makes sense that God would put us into congregations. He would want us. Besides the idea I mentioned before, you have a lot of responsibilities to other people. You have responsibilities to weak Christians, to Christians that have fallen away, Galatians chapter 5, bearing the burdens of others. How are you going to do that living outside a local body of Christ? So it's real important to see our responsibilities there.
It'd be pretty tough to imitate Jesus as a loner.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we certainly have to do that, imitate Jesus. Um, that's the passage in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. We gathered together to break bread. Paul talked with them. So they were things that Christians did together in the assembly. I think premier of that was the Lord's Supper, in the sense that it was attached to the first day of the week. And we get specific instructions about taking the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, and about when the church was together. Now, a couple of other questions. How do local churches begin? How does one join a local church? Now you could ask different denominational churches about that, and they might come up with different reasons, different answers. They might say, well, to join our church, you have to do this, or you have to follow these rules, or this is what you have to do to be be a member of the Baptist church, or to be a member of the Methodist church. These are the requirements. And that's fine. Men's churches can have any kind of requirements they want. They're churches of men. But if I want to be a part of the church that belongs to Jesus, then I need to find in the New Testament how one became a part of a local church and what that involved, what that was all about. Here's one of my takes on it, and for what it's worth. How does the Lord establish local churches? We go to Acts chapter 2, and we see that he established the universal church through the preaching of the gospel and individuals responding to the gospel. He established it through the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, through Jesus being ascended to the throne, everything that Peter mentions there in that sermon. So we could answer that question that way. And in that sense, he established a local church at Jerusalem by the preaching of the gospel. The Lord also established a local church at Corinth, and you see other places at Rome, through the preaching of the gospel, that when individuals respond to the gospel of the Lord and they were added to the universal church, then they did things together, and that then comprised the local church as they did things together. I think I might think of it in the same way that does God institute marriage? Sometimes we use that language. Marriage is a divine institution. God instituted marriage. If someone asks you, show me where God instituted marriage, where would you go? Where would you take them? Maybe Genesis 2, Adam and Eve. He is she's flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones.
Matthew 19.
Matthew 19, the idea that God put a man and a woman together, and by the creation of the inaugural putting together of Adam and Eve, he created an institution by defining its parameters. And the idea here that he would establish this by providing instructions to its function, showing its purpose. And that's what he did for marriage. So God instituted marriage in the beginning, and he continues to institute marriages today by what the Word of God says about marriage and what it ought to be. In the same way is about the local church. God continues to establish local churches that belong to Christ by the preaching of the gospel, have to come into Christ, but then also by the function that we're given to do together, and how God regulates that from his word, so that a marriage is established at the consent of two people. People have to agree to get married. Do people have to agree to make a local church? Yeah, they gotta consent together. They have to fellowship each other and decide to fellowship each other. And that's what we find in Acts chapter 9. And I think this is the best place I could go in the New Testament to explain to someone how a person becomes a part of a local church. It's like Paul did in Acts chapter 9. You remember Paul was formerly Saul of Tarsus, and then he was converted to the Lord. Ananias baptized him in Damascus, and he became a Christian. And it says there that he began to preach the gospel, and it says that when he came to Jerusalem, he was at Damascus. When he came to Jerusalem, it says in chapter 9, verse 26, that he attempted to join the disciples. There was already a church in Jerusalem, right? So he comes to Jerusalem, and here's this local church, there's Christians. He wants to join them, but it says, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. So why wouldn't they just let him in? Can anybody be a part of our church? The brethren Joseph said, no, wait a minute. He's got to be a disciple. He can't be a part of us. When they found out that he was a disciple, Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he'd preached boldly in the name of Jesus. Then they accepted him. Barnabas vouched for him, said, yeah, he's a Christian. He's been converted, and he's been preaching the gospel. So it says in verse 28, he went in and out and among them at Jerusalem, preaching boldly in the name of the Lord. So I would submit to you that Paul was a member of the local church at Jerusalem, in the sense that he attempted to join. There were requirements that had to be met before he could join, but then he did join, and he fellowshipped them. He went in and out among them, and he preached the gospel in their behalf in Jerusalem. So what happened there? Well, there was this. This is all about fellowship, I believe. Paul wanted fellowship with the church at Jerusalem, but he couldn't take it of himself. They had to extend that fellowship. So when they found out that he was a Christian, they extended fellowship, and he consented to join their group, and so that they had then a partnership. So that's what a local church is. People decide they're going to fellowship each other, and they extend fellowship to each other in the things that they do together, or they jointly participate. Remember that definition we had earlier? They jointly participate in the things that God has given them to do. That is certainly clear in the aspect of 1 Corinthians 16, when the members of the church pooled their resources. They brought their contribution together, and they put it in a single contribution, and then that contribution was used. They were sharing in that work. Paul called it fellowship. He said, you had fellowship with me when I went out and preached, because you gave money to my support. So you fellowshiped me in that work. You jointly participated in that. So we jointly participate. That's why Paul could say to the church at Corinth, you need to be of one mind and one judgment, that you're divided. And he even saw it in the assembly. But he said you need to be of one mind and one judgment, because you have consented together to work together. So you have to agree about the things that you're going to do together. So John, you look at the epistles of John, and in the teachings of John, in 2 John, John warns the Christians that he's writing to and says, be careful. There are false teachers out there, and you don't want to extend fellowship to those who are not abiding in the doctrine of Christ. If a person doesn't abide in the doctrine of Christ, he does not have God. So don't give him Godspeed. Don't extend fellowship to him if he's not truly serving God. So, and then in the 3rd John, in the next epistle, John writes specifically to warn the church about a man named Diotrephes, who was kicking people out of the church. So he was excluding people. So both those dangers. We might accept somebody in that God doesn't fellowship, or we might kick somebody out that God is fellowshipping. So we have that responsibility, don't we, as a church? We have responsibility to make that decision. Do we always make it right? No, sometimes we mess up. Sometimes we might very well have someone come in and fellowship them, and then find out later on they're not really serving God at all. they're a hypocrite or they're immoral, such as the church at Corinth was fellowshipping a man who was sleeping, who was having sexual relationships with somebody he didn't have a right to have sexual relationships with. Paul says you got to put them out of the fellowship. You have to discipline them. Uh, and so there's always that danger. Well, that's one of the distinctions between the local church and the universal church. The universal church is God's adding. He's the one who decides who's in fellowship and who's not. He doesn't make any mistakes. If God adds me to the church, I'm in the church. If he takes away the candlestick, he takes away the candlestick. He doesn't make any mistakes there, but he gives me the responsibility and us responsibility as a congregation and even as an individual to extend fellowship to other people. We might very well and do make mistakes about that. That's why we have to make sure that we stay with what God says. We have to diligently try to walk in the way that God's told us to walk and to make judgments based upon God's words. So that's, I think, an important element, that idea of extending and withdrawing fellowship. Because sometimes the church assembles for the very purpose of withdrawing fellowship from someone that's living a rebellious life. There to withdraw fellowship from him. That doesn't condemn them to hell. The church can't condemn anybody to hell, but it meets the responsibility that we have as a congregation to not allow sin into the body, and to recognize that we have to extend it, withdraw fellowship. Paul puts it in the context of leaven, influence of leaven, 1 Corinthians 5. Okay. Any thoughts on that? Maybe I went off base a little bit there talking about all that, but the idea here of how a person becomes a part of a local congregation.
I got a question. Go ahead, Ralph.
I was just going to say, anybody that has moved around a bit, like Tracy and I have, and you get to know the new congregation, there's always questions and answers that are there and voluntarily given, because people want to know,
yeah,
and make sure of that. But it's usually done. For me, it's been done quite respectfully. And I remember when John Greenfield came to Southside, and speaking up for him, and that's what it takes. It takes everybody.
That's right. And the idea that it's both ways, in the sense that I know, and Henley and I work here as elders here. We have occasion people decide they want to come from other places, they want to be a part of a member of the Southside Church. We need to meet together, and we meet, talk. And there are two parts of that conversation. One is that we need to know something about them, determine whether or not they're truly Christians, they're truly disciples. And then we need to let them know, and we do let them know, what we do together. This is what we spend our money on. This is what we do in our worship. This is how because they're going to have to fellowship us in that. So you can't ask them to fellowship something that they don't know anything about. So if they're going to participate with us, they need to know all about it. And so that's what we try to do. When those things are out there, then there's the opportunity for fellowship to exist. So it is a transparent type of, so to speak, process, as it was, I think, in Acts chapter 9.
Just quick, can I ask a question, Dave?
Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
This whole idea is, I'm trying not to be cantankerous, and it kind of fascinates me. So fella comes in and he wants to join the disciples like Paul did, and the disciples say no. What does that mean? Does that mean you shut the door on them? They're not allowed to come to worship? Or like what we do is, well, we're not going to consider you one of us, but you can come and sing and pray and worship. You can partake of the Lord's Supper. You can give. We're just not going to call you a disciple. Oh, we won't let you lead something. It seems to me to be there's something missing in my thinking, and I'll leave it at that. Maybe you can help me clean it up.
I think some of that seems more obvious to me than others. I think what John instructs about when he gives instructions about what we would think of the person who is not in a right relationship with God. Now, I know he's talking about false teachers, but the idea of extending fellowship would be involved in that. That we would say, okay, you're not going to come in here in a leadership position and influence this congregation when we don't consider you to be a right relationship with God yourself. So there would be decisions that would be made on a local basis whether or not this person was going to be in a position where he's going to lead others, teach others, and influence others. Uh, so there's some of that I think is just is a matter of in terms of that's why it's a beautiful thing that it's a local congregation doing it and not one rule for everybody. Some of that has to be discretion and the idea of knowing what's involved and what's going to happen. Some situations are more leavening than others. Some situations involve more influence than others. We don't ever say a person can't come and worship with us, that we're going to keep them out of the assembly. Now, we might, if that person was being divisive, if they were being rebellious and they were coming into the assembly for the purpose of specifically teaching false doctrine and dividing the congregation, might shut the doors on them. And I don't think God would want us to do anything other than that to protect the flock. You can't protect the flock unless you do what needs to be done to keep it from being influenced by evil. But the idea of simply not recognizing that this person has not met all the conditions of being a child of God would not, I don't think, warrant the idea. In fact, it would just the opposite of that. It would certainly make possible the idea that you need to come and worship and be in our assemblies and participate with us in the worship assembly. But we don't consider that you have met all the conditions of being a child of God yet. Part of that is so that that person can know what they need to do to be a Christian. If we don't make any judgments about that, if we don't make any discernments about that, then everyone who comes into the assembly might very well assume that they are right with God when they're not right with God. They've been baptized, they've been sprinkled as a baby, or that they've been involved in a cult where they've never learned what the truth is about Jesus Christ. They're just coming into our assembly. So I think some of that is for the betterment of the person that you're dealing with. It's not just for the protection of the church, but so that distinction can be made. Say, we don't think you're a Christian. We think there's more that you need to do to become a child of God. Does that make sense?
Sure. And I think when Paul came, they said, we don't believe he's a disciple. Now, if anybody was a disciple, it was Paul.
Yeah.
They didn't believe it. And so they certainly we can make mistakes in judgment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that would be unfortunate because we're sort of closing out people who are disciples and want to worship with us. I just find the whole joining and what does that mean? And
well, but I think I don't see any way that that you could function, so to speak, if that's the right way to put it, in terms of a discipline and a shepherding perspective, without having some idea of who's a Christian and who's not in a congregation.
And is the answer to that? I'm a member of the Universal Church. I've been baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of my sins. Now, there might be other things I'm not doing or am doing that might be detrimental, but you're a part of us, and now it's a learning thing. Or how much do you need to know about the person? Like scripturally, how much do you really need to know about a person?
I think Acts 9 answers that question to me in the sense that is he a disciple? The apostle said, Jesus told the apostles to go out and make disciples of all nations. So have they done what the apostles preached in terms of becoming a disciple? If they have, then that answers that question.
Okay.
There may be other things that are involved in terms of their life that they need to correct. But like I said, you can't, if you're going to be effective shepherd in that regard, you can't keep them out of the place where they're going to be taught.
Yeah.
But if they're not a disciple, then I think that's clearly something that needs to be pointed out. And that's what the Church of Jerusalem wanted to know. Is he a disciple? You know what I'm saying? So, okay. Any other thoughts on that? I think I have another passage here. Oh, we talked about overseers and the local, again, the distinction between the universal church and the local church. The local church does have leadership, but Peter makes the distinction. He says that he was a shepherd, but he also said there was a great shepherd. There was one great shepherd who was over all of them. So that's the distinction. We have a shepherd, Jesus, who is over the whole church, but local congregations also have shepherds, and we talked about that. And then 1 Timothy chapter 3 were deacons, a word that means servant, people that were put in charge of serving others. Such I believe Acts chapter 6 is an example of that. But Philippians chapter 1, 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1. One other passage in Ephesians chapter 4, and then we'll be finished for tonight. What is the purpose of the church locally in terms of how it is to impact the individual? What good is it to be a part of the local church? Well, certainly it facilitates my worship together, and it facilitates also the aspect of my serving other people. We talked about that before. But Paul addresses in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 12, this aspect of the work of the church corporately for the benefit of the individual. When he says it's for the equipping of the saints, and when he says for, he's looking back to the gifts that God has given unto the church, Jesus has given unto the church in the apostles and prophets and pastors and teachers, that these are the evangelists and teachers, that these are the teaching people that are going to be doing teaching in the church. What's it for? It's for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So what Paul's saying there, I believe, is that the church, the local church teaches, and individuals that are part of the gifts they're given to the church teach the truth so that each individual member can be equipped. And the individual members are equipped so that they can do the work of the ministry. So that the work of the church is not done by a clergy, it's not done by certain individuals. The work of the church is done by saints, that's individual Christians, that are equipped through the teaching. And that's so that the church of Christ, the church of Christ or the body of Christ will be built up for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the saints, till we come to the unity of faith, the knowledge of God. So the goal is to be like Jesus. And the local church facilitates that. It provides for the opportunity for me to become stronger and to grow and equip myself so that I can do the work of ministry so that Christians can be built up. Hebrews chapter 10, 24, where it talks about assembly, says much the same type of thing. When he says there, we come together to provoke unto love and good works, that we, some translations say, stir up. So our meeting together is to stir each other up, that we might love each other, we might learn to do good works. And that's what the church is for, along those lines. So again, if you're not a part of a local church, then you're sabotaging your spiritual growth in that regard from the standpoint of being a Christian. Okay. Any questions or comments on that?
I was thinking about Hosea when he says, "My people are destroyed because of their lack of knowledge." As you know, it's one of the reasons why we get together.
That's right. And that, you think that's distinct in religion today, that's something that's not, it's just not there as much as it used to be. People getting together to study the Word of God, to put their minds on what the Bible teaches for the sake of learning, coming to an agreement of what the Bible says, putting it into practice. Assembly, many times in religion today, is just a matter of entertainment, getting together and feeling good. And that's foreign to what the New Testament teaches. It's a misdefinition of what worship is, but it's a realignment of the purpose of assembly to simply go to be entertained. It was never intended to be that way.
Dave, in Ephesians 3 and 10, when he says, so that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the rulers and authorities. Is he speaking, you think, universally, that the church universal would make known the manifold wisdom of God, or is he just talking about all the different local churches doing that, or is it determined?
I don't know. I would interpret that to be the universal church, that through the saving of God's people, the assembling of his people, he has made known to all the spiritual forces that he's wise, that he's done things right. I don't know. How do you see that? You think that's
I thought universal, right? I read it. I just was thinking, how does God's wisdom spread? It's through the church.
Yeah.
How is the church going to do that? They're going to have to do that in local assemblies, reaching out to people everywhere. So it's just, to me, it was kind of.
Yeah, it is. Is this facilitated through the individual even, but as well towards in the congregation, that the spreading of the gospel, making known. We sing songs like that along that line, right? God has no hands but my hands. He has no feet but my feet. That we have a responsibility to spread the gospel. And if we don't do it, who will? If the church isn't the one corporately and individually that's spreading the gospel, making good news, who will do that?
Do you
Uh,
think that and then I'll stop talking. The in the first century, I know that the churches had visitors according to First Corinthians. But do you think in the first century Christians were made um, in the byways and highways and then came together to worship, or that they had, or was the assembly the place where you had to come to hear the gospel, and so we emphasize visitors? Or do you think things have changed and made the whole sort of joining thing more complicated than maybe it was for them, right? Like
yeah,
when Paul wanted to join them, who was he joining? Well, he was just joining disciples. I don't know if he was in the midst of 100 visitors, that kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah. I think there probably is a change of emphasis. I would certainly agree with that. And sometimes the assembly really becomes focused on people that visit with us and people that are not Christians. It's more oriented time, and I think there's good and bad to that. I think that it shouldn't be completely oriented that way, but assemblies can be evangelistic, and I think people need to be able to understand what's going on. That's what Paul was saying about the confusion in Corinth, is that about the tongues, that if there's no interpreter there, the people that are visiting can't say amen. They can't know whether or not even what's been going on. And as though they should, he's implying that they should be able to understand what's going on. So that being said, but I don't think the assemblies, if I understand what you're saying, I don't see the assemblies as being primarily evangelistic tools that we're going to come together, invite people to come in, and that people are going to be converted in the church building. I think they were going house to house teaching the truth. And Paul joined himself to the disciples, and then he went out and preached the gospel. That's the way I would read Acts 9 in that. But we
And
do
if you look at
go ahead.
the examples that we have of the Ethiopian eunuch, the Philippian jailer, those things, I mean, they didn't happen in an assembly.
Yeah, that's right.
That
Yeah,
that,
outside.
that by hearing God's word,
Yeah.
right? But
And I think some of that emphasis is based upon the entertainment element of it. That we want to do something that pleases the what they call the unchurched. We need to attract and please the unchurched. No, we need to teach the unchurched. We don't need to appease them or entertain them. We need to teach them. In terms of, by unchurched, I mean people that are not Christians. But we borrowed that many times from the denominational world with the emphasis of our worship. Someone said that we always have to keep in mind who the audience is when it comes to worship. It's not us, and it's not the world. The audience of our worship is God, and that always has to be kept in mind. Yeah. Uh, isn't that a thrilling thing to know that it doesn't have to be everything? It doesn't have to be perfectly in tune to be worship. In fact, I read this kind of goes along something that Todd and were talking about earlier individually about the idea of being consumed with the idea of singing and whether or not it's good or bad. And uh, and I'm guilty of this. I worry about that too much because I can't sing, and I worry about when I lead sing and how bad it is. But the the fellow who was writing the article was encouraging the leadership of churches to send men to this song leading seminar so they could learn to lead songs properly in tune and learn new songs. And he made the statement that unless we do this, the churches will not be able to properly worship. And I thought, ooh, I just don't believe that we have to get everything in tune for there to be worship, or that all these things have to fall in line, or we have to learn the newest song, or we're not going to be worshiping. That's a very superficial view. Worship takes place in my heart. And I can have a room full of people that sound like chickens, like I do, and we can still be worshiping. See, so I think that's something we have to keep in mind. Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Let me tell you what I want to do maybe in some lessons. I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about worship. I want to talk a little bit more about the idea of what defines worship and how we worship corporately together so that we have a better view of how the church did it in the first century. And then we talk about the work of the church. What does the church do corporately together? When we put our money together, what do we use that money for? And what's the purpose of that? And not so much to talk about about institutionalized religion, but to talk about the idea of understanding that what we are contributing to something being done. It's not just putting money in a pot, that there was work to be done when the money was put into a pot, and that's what we need to be engaged in. Okay. Any thoughts, comments, ideas? Thank you for coming, folks. Appreciate it. Love y'all. And
Thanks,
we'll see you next week.
Gotcha.
Thank you for your time. Love
Thank
you
you,
guys. Be
David.
safe.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
We will.